Well, welcome, a very warm welcome to everybody. Some of you may still be migrating from the waiting room into the webinar, but we'll get started. Let me introduce myself first. My name is Tim Livesey. I'm the chief executive of Embrace the Middle East, which is a UK charity which works with, work with 50 partners in various parts of the Middle East, including the Holy Land. And we're co-hosting, really pleased to co-host this series with CMEP. We hosted a similar series of 4 parts in the summer looking at Christian Zionism in particular, which proved popular. So really pleased to have everybody here. A very warm welcome to you, whether you're in the UK, you're in the US, whether it's the evening, it's the afternoon, and who knows, maybe there's even people for whom it's the morning, but you're most welcome. And as invited in the chat, if you'd like to just say, who you are and where you're from, it's kind of nice to get the sense of the spread of people and places that are participating in the seminar, the webinar tonight. So, as I say, this is the second in a 4-part series, which is looking at various aspects of life in the Holy Land, the reality that is the Holy Land today, some of which was previously explored in a book, which you probably can't see because of the blur, but it's some of you will be familiar with it. A Land Full of God, edited by May Elise Cannon, who's the director of CMEP. And some of those who are helping to guide us through our discussions in this seminar contributed to this book, not all, but some, one of whom is Daryl, who I'll speak about in a moment. And the idea is really, in the course of this series, to explore a range of considerations relating to the Holy Land. And in this second part, we're going to focus on theological considerations, various theological considerations, including but not solely related to Christian Zionism. A brief word, if I may, about last week. We had a wonderful conversation which grew out of 2 contributions from Dale Hansen-Book and Andrea Andy Lee Smith, who may be known to you. And that gave rise to a really rather beautiful conversation, and I hope that the same will happen again today. And one of the things that emerged in the conversation, which seemed to be quite significant, was the question that you might like to have at the back of your mind as you listen this evening and participate. And that is, who am I in relation to these issues? And what might I be being called to do, or to say, or to think, or to understand? And I'd like to invite you to be part of the conversation. So later on, please do post questions that occur to you in the course of our discussion, because we'd like to branch out into those areas towards the end of our time. But first of all, we're going to hear from our speakers. I'm going to introduce them each in turn, and then I'll circle back to the first of them, namely Daryl, who will kick us off. So Daryl Dr. Daryl Bock is the executive director of cultural engagement and senior research professor of New Testament studies at Dallas Theological Seminary. Daryl is the author of over 40 books, and I won't read them all out. That would take too long. And he's also served in his time as president of the Evangelical Theological Society and as a consulting editor for Christianity Today. And Daryl did contribute to our essays. He contributed an essay entitled Hope in the Midst of Mess. So in a moment, we'll come back to Daryl. But first, I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Gary Burge, who is also a professor of New Testament at Calvin Theological Seminary. He's also a Presbyterian pastor or minister. Gary is a frequent visitor to the Holy Land and to the Middle East more widely. He's written extensively on the New Testament, as you would expect, and specifically on Christian Zionism and on modern day Israel. Incidentally, as you probably will all know, today Israel has been electing a new something or other, a government possibly, a new prime minister. We'll have to wait and see. And I know that Gary will definitely, at least as part of his remarks, look at aspects of Christian Zionism. And then finally, Liam Allmark, I'm delighted to welcome Liam, who's a colleague of mine. Liam will respond to the things he's heard from Daryl and Gary, and lead us into the next phase of our evening, which will be an open conversation between the panelists. Liam is, let me get this right, Liam, you are the Senior Policy and Research Analyst at the Catholic Bishops' Conference of England and Wales, which means that Liam is both an advisor and a coordinator of the interest in engagement with a whole bunch of a variety of global issues, from peace building to the promotion of human rights, that are seen as a priority by the bishops in England and Wales. And in particular, they and he have had taken a close interest in recent years in the Holy Land, as well as Iraq and also Myanmar. So that is our panel. And without further ado, Daryl, I'd like to invite you, if you would, to lead off our conversation this evening. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tim, for the introduction, and greetings to the panelists and to those of you who are attending. I'm just going to dive right in and talk about the question of, does Israel have the right to the land, and what does that mean for her as a people? And I'm going to start off since this is theological consideration, I'm going to start off in Genesis 12, 1-3, because the issue of the land leads off this promise in Genesis 12, 1. The text says, "Now the Lord said to Abraham, go out from your country, your relatives, your father's household, to the land I will show you." The people of Israel are going to exemplify divine blessing. That's why he's called them out to be his people in the Old Testament. And of course, their failure to do that in the midst of the Old Testament is part of the conversation that we'll have. That verse declares, that a verse that says they're going to exemplify divine blessing. "Then I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great so that you will exemplify divine blessing." This is part of what makes their testimony a lasting one. They function as a people, as a witness to God. That witness is not just seen in the person of Messiah. This very Israel is distinguished from the nations within the promise in verse 3, as the blessing to the world will come through them and the seed of Abraham. Verse 3 states, "I will bless those who bless you, but the ones who treat you lightly I must curse. So all the families of the earth may receive blessing through you," through the seed. And of course, one of the things that will make our conversation interesting is this seed is both plural and singular. It's plural in the development of the nation, which is the story of the Pentateuch, how this one person, Abraham, gave birth to a nation that became the 12 tribes of Israel, and also the seed singular Christ, which is highlighted in Galatians 3:16. Genesis 12:7 speaks of this promise as being for Abraham's descendants or seed. That verse reads, "To your descendants I will give this land." In Genesis 13:15-16, the seed promise is repeated. "I will give all of this land you see to you and to your descendants forever. I will make your descendants like the dust of the earth." That's the plurality in the promise of the seed. "So that if anyone is able to count the dust of the earth, then your descendants can also be counted." So I sometimes joke when I read this passage, go in your backyard, pull out a plot of ground, put it on your patio and count how many grains of dirt there are. That tells you what this promise is about. The stars in the sky is another comparison that's made with this image later on in Genesis. Now, in the New Testament, the seed is seen as Jesus the Christ. Galatians 3:16, he is seed par excellence, as the executor of this promise. But Israel as a people among the nations still remains as a part of that promise. And that's part of the point that I want to make theologically, that whatever Jesus Christ brings in fulfillment, particularly with regard to salvation, there are commitments that God has made to Israel as a people that he keeps and reaffirms. So here comes their affirmation. The promise is reiterated to the patriarchs of Israel in numerous places, with the land for her being specifically mentioned. Land is specifically mentioned in the reaffirmation of the promise to Abraham in Genesis 15:5-7, in Genesis 15:18-21, in Genesis 17:1-8, to Isaac in Genesis 26:2-5, and to Jacob in Genesis 28:3-4 and 13-15. From this, one can conclude that the promise of blessing as a people involves the inclusion of a land for them that is at peace among the nations. That's going to be important when we get down the road to the eschatology that's attached to this. The book of Genesis ends with a promise about this land as Joseph was buried in a cave located in the field of Machpelah. But God will surely come to you and lead you from this land to the land he swore an oath to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Genesis 50:24. This is a promise of a land for a specific nation of people. And so keeping this promise is about God keeping his word and about the faithfulness of God that he exercises towards this people whom he has called out. The idea of people and land is not limited to the book of Genesis. The Lord says to Moses in Exodus 6:4, I will establish my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, where they were living as resident foreigners. And it's repeated again in verse 8. I will bring you to the land I swore to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you as a possession. I am the Lord. And there are numerous other mentions of this text. Now, sometimes it's declared that Israel disqualifies herself from this promise by the way in which she has behaved. But Deuteronomy 28:62, which comes in the midst of the cursings and blessings to the nation, talks about being very few people left after the judgment of God, though at one time you were as numerous as the stars of the sky, because you've disobeyed the Lord your God. Yet by the time we get to Deuteronomy 30, this blessing and the idea of the 12 being returned to the land is reaffirmed. And we see this pattern of God disciplining the nation for disobedience and yet returning her to the land in patterns we see in the Old Testament involving Assyria and Babylon. The similar cycle is noted also in Ezekiel 20. The point that I'm making here is that this idea is reaffirmed again and again and again and again. And disobedience at a given point doesn't mean the forsaking of Israel as a people in terms of where God is taking the plan as a whole. And it also sees Israel existing among the nations as this promise is made. So she doesn't get absorbed into something else as we talk about this promise. Now, the eschatological side of this gets mentioned in two particular important texts of the Old Testament, Isaiah 2:1-4 and Isaiah 19:16-25. Isaiah 2:1-4 is a very famous text. In fact, part of it shows up if you walk to the United Nations in New York. You'll see the idea of the peace of the passage expressed in Isaiah 2-4, expressed as part of what the United Nations is supposed to be about. It says, in future days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will endure as the most important of mountains, as the most prominent of hills. All the nations will stream to it. Many peoples will come and say, come, let us go up to the temple of God of Jacob, so he can teach us his requirements and we can follow his standards. For Zion will be the center of moral instruction, and the Lord's message will issue from Jerusalem. And then in Isaiah 19:16-25, it's a very interesting text where there's a highway. Some of you are in Britain, so I'll call it the M1. A highway that extends from Egypt through Jerusalem to Assyria, two traditional enemies of Israel who are now brought together by what it is God will do. It says that all three will worship God together on this earth, nations and people united, each with their own identity. Isaiah 19:25 reads, the Lord of the heaven's armies will pronounce blessing over the earth, saying, blessed be my people, Egypt, the work of my hands, Assyria, and my special possession, Israel. All are blessed by the Lord. Israel as Egypt as my people, Assyria is the work of God's hands, and Israel as God's special possession. What this means, as we look to the final shalom to which the promise is working, is that we are not engaged in a discussion of nationalism here, but in a discussion of an eventual bringing of peace that Christ himself will bring to the earth, in which Israel as a nation will have a role, And again, depending on your Christian theology, whether you're amillennial or premill, if you're premillennial, you see Jesus coming back to the earth and ruling from the earth, perhaps even specifically from Jerusalem itself. So this is where the promise in part takes us. It takes us to the land of God's promise and presence, tied to a people called Israel, living ultimately in peace with the rest of the world through what it is that Christ will do. There's a unity and diversity here. There's an equality yet distinction, and a perpetual evidence of the reconciliation God brings to all and to all nations through his work of new covenant and his Davidic heir and his kingdom. Israel stands at the center of the world because of her Messiah, and in it God has kept his word to the patriarchs about the nation because God keeps his promises with whom he makes them. And so I'll just close by noting in saying this, that raises important questions about how we view Israel today in the midst of its journey, because it's outside of faith on the one hand and yet exists as a people with a hope on the other. I'll note that Romans 9-11 from the apostles looks forward to a day in which natural branches which have been cut out of the tree will be grafted back in at some point in the future, and then all Israel will be saved. We could debate whether Israel in that passage at that point is a limited view of basically Jewish believers, or whether it's a broad view of Israel made up of Jews and Gentiles. Either way, Israel is included, because the burden of Romans 9-11 is to have Paul talk about those people for whom Paul wishes he could die so that they could be blessed and he would be cursed. And so we have unbelieving Israel in view in that entire section, with the hope expressed at the end that things will, that Israel in part will return, in fact, in a significant part, will return to being faithful to Messiah. My final remark is, this fits with what Jesus said when he declared Israel's house desolate in Luke 13:34 and 35. It says, "Behold, I declare your house desolate until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." The point that I'm making is salvation and its blessings come through Christ for sure, and the singular seed is the source of fulfillment. But there is a commitment that God has made to the nation of Israel to have a land and to be at peace with her neighbors. I guess the analogy is the European Union. We have Italians and Germans and French in the European Union. They're all Europeans, but they have national identity. I won't ask how I've asked Britain to fit into that. I'll save that for another conversation. But it's that kind of picture that eschatologically we're moving towards. And Israel has a place in the world amongst the nations in the peace that Jesus will bring, not just to individual people, but to nations as well. And with that, I'm done.
Daryl, thank you. That was quite a canter. Gary, let's go straight to you.
Great. Thank you, Tim.
And sorry, just before you do, I'm good to see that Lydia has posted a question. Do please keep them posting, because there will come a moment where I'll want to pick them up, but if they're not there, I won't be able to. So as they occur, do post your questions. If you can put them in the Q&A, that's brilliant, but the chat works as well. Sorry, Gary, over to you.
No, that's good. Good note. Well, it's great to be with you, Tim and Liam, and my old friend Daryl. This is an important topic, and I'm glad we are taking it in hand. The first thing is, I think it's important for us to make sure that we know what we're talking about. This is not a conversation about Israel's right to exist. It is not a conversation really about Israel having a place in the world or Israel living at peace with its neighbors. That should be true of any country inside of the world. The conversation about Christian Zionism is really about the theological basis of modern Israel's identity. That's what Christian Zionism is touching on, the theological basis of modern Israel's identity. So since it's about that, Christian Zionism is really what scholars call a political theology. It's a political theology. I'll explain that. And what it leads to in modern Israel is what we call religious nationalism. That is to say, I have a strong commitment to my own nation, but the reason I do so is because I think there is a religious endorsement of my nation. So you're not going to find that in many nations of the world, but in Israel's case, for many people, There is a nationalism that has a kind of divine privilege, a divine entitlement that is coming with it. So therefore, it is a political theology. So political theologies, what they do is they take one particular theological emphasis and they apply it to one particular political question. That's what political theologies do, precisely what we have here. Let me illustrate it like this. You might find like theologies that come out of Latin America or Africa, where they look inside of the Bible and they emphasize particular texts which work with justice concerns, and then they draw those threads into their own political circumstances, and they run a critique of their governments or societies based on those texts. So you might have a Brazilian theology that actually is then working with justice issues and then applying them to Brazil. So what you have is in Israel is this very same thing. You have Christians and Jews. There's Jewish Zionism as well, but you have Christians in our case taking particular theological themes and applying them to a political sort of entity, a country. Now, what are the theological threads that modern Christian Zionists are going to work with? The first is this. Let me just give you three. First is that modern Israel is the resumption of the life of biblical Israel. A very simple idea. So therefore, you can be with Christian Zionist groups in Israel itself, and you can hear them talking about things such as, when I'm in this Holy Land, I just feel that Abraham has walked in front of me. I go to the city of Jerusalem, and I just can hear the harp of David. So there's this connection which is made between Israel in the Bible and Israel as a modern state. And that question is never really challenged among Christian Zionists. So first of all, resumption of life in biblical Israel. Secondly, Christian Zionists will believe that their modern Israel is fulfilling prophecies. And therefore, what you have are Jews returning to the Holy Land, creating a state, and this is fulfilling promises like Daryl rightly pointed to in Genesis chapter 12. So there is what is used in Christian Zionist circles. There's an ingathering, which is now taking place in the Middle East, okay? Now, how is this supported? Not only will they pull those two threads from the Bible, but they will also then say, okay, I'm committed to Israel, not just simply because of those two threads, but because I'm also committed to what I call an eschatological drama. So for many Christian Zionists, they believe these prophecies are being fulfilled not for the sake of Israel. Let's be clear about that. For some who are committed to eschatology, these things are being fulfilled because a drama is unfolding, which is a uniquely Christian drama, and it will set the stage for Jesus coming back. So in some of these Christian Zionist theologies, the future for Israel is quite grim. There'll be a major war, most will die, others will convert. As one Jewish friend of mine in Israel said to me recently, we really do not like Christian Zionist theology because we seem to be the football that you guys are throwing around all the time. The other way that people will want to be passionate theologically about these threads they're pulling is because for some, eschatology really is not the ticket. For some, it is what they believe to be a right reading of biblical theology. So therefore, it springs from an understanding of the permanence of the covenant we have with Abraham. And therefore, you heard this, Daryl was saying this very clearly, the covenants of Abraham, therefore, are not superseded by any other covenant, especially the one that comes from Christ. So the benefits from those covenants continue to be used by modern Jews today. Now, for me personally, this picture that I've just painted for you and this profile of Christian Zionism has enormous problems, absolutely enormous problems. Let me just list a few of them. We only have a few minutes here, so it's funny when you write a book that goes for 200 or 300 pages, you're trying to distill everything into a few minutes. Not possible. So let me just try my shot at a few. The first thing I'm reminded of when I think about this story is that I think we as Christians need to be clear that whenever the church has attached itself to a political ideology, it has always regretted it. throughout the last 2,000 years, whenever the church has attached itself to a political ideology, it has always regretted it. It has come out sorely. Every generation has said, oh, but our time is different. This is different. This is a real fulfillment of prophecy. This is a unique period in history. Every generation says that kind of thing. So therefore, I think we need to be very, very cautious when we begin to talk about any modern political environment and put some kind of divine endorsement on it. Second thing that I'm reminded of is this: prophecy fulfillment is dangerously subjective. Because what I find happening again and again among Christian Zionist speakers is that they will pull the most, I guess, obscure passages out of especially the prophets like Ezekiel in particular, Daniel maybe. And what they will do is they say, this is now being fulfilled. The church has a terrible track record with prophecy fulfillment. Again and again in various generations, people have said, this is the moment of fulfillment. And it has not come to be. So we need to be cautious really about that. Here's the third concern that I don't see my Christian Zionist friends really talking about as honestly as they might. Modern Israel is a secular state. Let's be crystal clear about this. It is not a theocracy as you have inside of the Old Testament. When it wrote its constitution, it was intentional. In fact, when it wrote their constitution, they didn't want to actually even have the name of God there. They wanted to be intentionally secular. I have spent the night in a couple of Israeli settlements in which they are actually committed to atheism. In these moshav, they will not actually have a synagogue inside, and I will eat. When I was doing archaeology, I would sit at these tables and I would ask them, why no synagogue inside of here? And they would say to me, the God of the Bible after the Holocaust does not deserve to be worshipped or recognized. So it's an aggressive kind of Israel, as atheism in some places, but in other places, not necessarily so. But in all cases, it is a secular state. That's its intention. So I'm asking the very simple question of this. When you have a modern state of Israel, which has so, politically abandoned the commitments of the Old Testament and all of its covenants, how would Jeremiah think about that if he came to Tel Aviv? It seems to me the answer is very clear. Whenever historically in the Old Testament, whenever Israel abandons, steps away from the covenant, exile is the result. All right. So there's no toleration among the prophets for this kind of abandonment of God's word and God's voice in the state. Fourthly, though, I think the fatal flaw in Christian Zionism is theological, and it's theological on two counts. The first is that Old Testament prophets had relatively little to say about prediction. The Old Testament prophets were actually more committed, universally committed, to describing the moral problems of their own day. And so therefore they launched open public criticism of the government, and that is why you have people like Jeremiah being imprisoned. So if this is true, that according to the prophets, their interest is not simply in the fulfillment and establishment of a nation, but instead in the right living of the people in the nation, I look at the modern state of Israel, as Daryl has just acknowledged, there are just breathtaking moral lapses inside of the country, ethical problems inside of the nation, in which has led to modern Israel suffering from international criticism again and again. Not to mention the military occupation of a couple of million people who have no right of movement, no right to vote, it's amazing. And we just skim right over this. So therefore, I think if you were to look at Israel's ethical record, I think they would find that Jeremiah and Ezekiel, instead of celebrating the ingathering, they would be asking hard questions about ethics. But the second fatal theological flaw has to do with the New Testament. Whenever you hear Christian Zionists speak about this subject, they begin with the Old Testament and they spring their arguments right from the Old Testament, and the New Testament message seems to be missed again and again. When I read Paul, for instance, in Ephesians chapter 3, he says that he is the custodian of a mystery that has been revealed to him. And for Paul, the mystery is that here in this era of the Messiah, who are the people of God, who is Israel, is being refashioned. So he picks this up, for instance, in Romans chapter 11. He says, well, it's almost as if Abraham is this great olive tree. Abraham is at the root. And he says, those who do not have Christ, the natural branches, Jews without Christ, are broken off. And those Gentiles who do have Christ are added in. Therefore, what Paul understands is that there's a new community which has now been formed, and all of the language of the Old Testament used for Israel is now being used for the church. So therefore, Paul can say that Gentiles belong to Abraham. Gentiles are children of Abraham. But Christian Zionists again and again want to say those Jews who do not have Christ, who are broken branches, maybe Jews in Tel Aviv who are atheists, still can make a claim on the promises of Abraham. To me, that seems nonsensical. How can someone who has violated the covenants and disregarded the covenants still cash in on them? So therefore, when I think about Christian Zionism, I think, oh my gosh, I think it is it's problematic theologically, it's problematic ethically, but most of all, I think for me, it is a political ideology that someday, in 100 years, maybe 200 years, the church is going to look back on this period and they're going to regret.
Thank you, Gary. That was very clear. Liam, if you'd like to respond, and in so doing, of course, feel very free to introduce new thoughts, new directions of travel, and then we'll pick up at the end and we'll see where we go from there. Liam, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks to Darryl and Gary for absolutely fascinating presentations. And I feel there's so many questions going around in my head, and so much I've learned even from that short time. I'm really looking forward to our discussion. I think some of the key things I've taken from that is particularly, Darryl's question about the question at the heart of this: does Israel have the right to the land? And the biblical roots there, and the discussion that this was an idea that's reaffirmed again and again throughout Scripture. I think it means that this is something really important that we as Christians need to be engaging with. It's not necessarily a niche or a side question, but I think Darryl really clearly set out there why this discussion we're having now is so important and central. And I think the way you put it there was around Israel at the center of the world. And I think that's something that we really need to engage with. Darryl, also, you said that this raises important questions about how we see Israel today. And I think, again, that reaffirms that for some of us, there might be multiple different ways of addressing the Holy Land and our engagement with communities there, that often our engagement as churches is purely through a justice and peace prism, and actually introducing these important questions that need to be asked is something that needs to be considered. And I think at the heart of that as well, what it means about Israel having a place at peace among the nations. And was interested there that you almost strayed into the even more controversial position around the UK's place in Europe, and I found the analogy there really important. A question I'd ask off the back of that is where responsibility for that peace lies, and who has responsibility for recognising and promoting that peace. Gary, I think the juxtaposition of what you were saying there really sets such a strong framing for our conversation, and addressing it in the way that you said, that this isn't about a conversation about Israel's right to exist, that it's about identity. And I think actually today, with the elections taking place, a question in my mind is how much does this political theology, the religious nationalism you talked about, the rather unique nationalism, how much does that play into Israel's identity today in a very practical way? People who have been going to cast their votes, going to the ballot boxes today, and you touched on the point around Israel as a secular state today in 2022, and I'd be really interested to unpick how much this conversation and that rather unique religious nationalism you talked about is playing out, and is that something that we're seeing increasing or decreasing as time goes on? And I think there's definitely different schools of thought on that. Also really interesting the comparison you made, Gary, to the types of theology, for example, liberation theology we've seen in Latin America, and I think it's not a comparison I've widely heard, and that was actually, I think there's been a huge amount of engagement and critique of how those sort of theologies have been applied in other parts of the world, but never necessarily drawing the parallels to what's happening in the Holy Land, and maybe that's something that we should be doing more of. And I think a point you've made there as well, Gary, that will be, I'm sure, picked up in the Q&A, is that the church's record when it comes to align themselves to political theology or prophecy fulfillment, which I think are two things that really come to the heart of this, as well as that important theological debate about the interaction between New Testament and Old Testament scriptures. You mentioned, Gary, there, and I think this is something that's really struck me throughout these conversations, that the issue of the occupation is often skimmed over in the theological discussions. My question would be, in our engagement with what's happening in the Holy Land from a justice and peace perspective, do we sometimes skim over the theological considerations? I know there are actually two different prisms through which we as Christians in the UK, the US, elsewhere, are often engaging with the Holy Land, and should we be actually looking at both more? And this comes to that question Tim mentioned at the start that came out of the last seminar about who am I in this? What am I called to do? And I wonder, a question that's playing on my mind here is, does this conversation need to be happening more in our own churches, our own parishes, our own communities, that actually those who are viewing the issues we've talked about today purely through a theological perspective, should we be taking more of a practical justice and peace perspective on what's happening as well? And those who are approaching what's happening in the Holy Land purely through that justice and peace prism, should we be engaging more with some of these very important theological questions that have been raised today as well? And I think that's probably a big question for me that will hopefully frame some of our conversation.
Thank you very much. I'd like to come back to that in a second, if I may. But before we open up to a conversation for about 15 minutes or so, the group after which we'll open up some of the questions that have come in, some of the excellent, if I might say so, questions that have come in. And perhaps I could just introduce into the conversation something that very much came up last week that I'm reminded of as listening to the discussion. And this was in particular by Andy Lee Smith, who talked about specifically about the land and nationhood, the concepts of, in relation, of course, to the Holy Land, but actually in relation to other spheres as well, including North America. And she was keen to share with the group her deep concern. This is very much her study, her academic expertise. When claims to the land or claims to nationhood are exclusive, the problematic, which is as the sort of zero-sum approach, which I think is certainly apposite in this context, whereby that which I consider to be mine cannot be yours, and that to which I aspire must exclude you. And so this idea that it's not possible, if you like, for example, to put it at its most simplest, to share land, to share nationhood, to share a future. I think it feels right to just put to bring that aspect of the discussion last week into this discussion, because I think that I can feel them coming together. But perhaps we could pick up Liam's question, or Gary and Daryl. You know, it's perhaps a bit simplistic, but to say that on the one hand, we have people who tend to approach the issues under discussion through a theological lens, and others who tend to approach the discussion through much more of a preoccupation with justice and peace. And we're talking now about Christians, we're talking about people in their parishes, we're talking about people who go on pilgrimage, and indeed what they do when they go on pilgrimage, who they meet when they go on pilgrimage. And I think there's a sense in which, I hope I'm right in saying, Liam, that it needs to be both. It can't be one or the other, it needs to be both. Gary, Daryl, is it both for you?
Yes, it absolutely is both. And just to make an observation, even when the prophets are railing against Israel about her disobedience, they also are reaffirming God's commitment to them as a people. And so even in the midst of Israelite unfaithfulness, there is this commitment that God has to them, and to their hope, and to their future, and to their regathering. So I think that the danger that we have here is that we fall into an either or mode or something like that. And actually the challenge is as to how do I balance these two sets of concerns? Even the point that you mentioned earlier about sharing the land, my remark about the future hope not being nationalistic is moving in that direction. It's saying that ultimately there is a shalom that is to come, in which Israel will be a part, in which promises made to her about peace among the nations will take place. But part of the reason that peace is happening is because other nations are at peace with her. And so that is the aspiration to which eschatology ultimately takes us. And that is the aspiration towards which we are trying to move. The idea that Zionism is exclusively about Israel may reflect where some Zionists are, but I'm not sure it necessarily reflects where Zionism has to be. And remember that part of the reason you have the land of Israel is because of the realities of the Holocaust and the right of Israel to have a land for herself in which she could potentially feel safe in light of what took place in Europe during World War II and before World War II. So there are so many dimensions to this, thousands of years in the making, that it does make the conversation complex.
Tim, I think that one of the things that you mentioned, I think is terribly interesting, is, and you as Europeans are going to understand this better than we in America. We are a deeply multi-ethnic environment over here. My neighbors are Swedish, German, Dutch, Polish, Russian. But as we know, for the last 150 years and beyond, there has been a kind of European tribalism that always seems to be able to rise. And I think today an example could be Hungary is a good example of that. In other words, this notion that was given full national form at the late 19th century that said, you know, it's blood and soil. It is the call of blood and soil. That is my ancestry, the blood that I share with these people and the soil that I stand on. These belong to us and they do not belong to you. So we see this coming in Hungary, and I think we see it also flourishing in other places all over Europe. And what we have in Israel today is a blood and soil argument, which has never ended well in any place it has happened inside of the world. A few years ago, Israel passed what's called a nation state law, in which they put in writing, it is now officially law, that Israel is a place made for Jews, Therefore 20% of its population really don't belong. That's just the people who hold Israeli citizenship. That would be the equivalent of America making a legal statement saying America was for white people. And therefore 18% of our population, they're Black, they really don't belong. So there you have an argument for blood and soil. And I think when that happens, it's inevitable that people are going to experience discrimination, they'll experience occupation. You'll have to use your military in order to keep those who are disenfranchised in place. So I find this as what happens is I think we hunker down into sort of minuscule arguments about theology, but actually when I stand back and I look at the project of Israel since 1948, I see it fitting into a program which Europe has known for a long time. Essentially, Israel is a European country. It was born out of the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, and that is when so many European countries were formed, and they were ethnicities looking for a homeland. And that's what Ben Gurion was looking for. Where do we have our homeland? The Germans have this, the French have that. Well, we are going to go and take our own homeland, and it's going to be for us, an argument for blood and soil. So I'm not just skeptical, it worries me. It seems problematic, but also it's frightening.
Yeah, and for me, Gary, that ignores the history of anti-Semitism in the history of the world and why it is that Jews would want to have a land for themselves, the experience that they had, whether it be in Russia or in Europe. And so I don't think you can ignore, I think sometimes you characterize things. And I don't think you can ignore the fact that when Israel came into the land and sought to have its own homeland, that there are nations who basically said, you have absolutely no right to be here, and we want to wipe you off the face of the earth. And that's been done repeatedly in history to the Jewish people. And I just don't think that can be ignored. That's part of the reason you've got the blood and soil problem, is because of the hostility with which Jews have been treated by different segments of the population in the world, because Jews have been a minority in the population. You were talking about 2% of the world's population here. And so I think that can't be ignored as a part of the story and a part of I'll characterize it myself, part of the nervousness that Israelis have about their own existence, because they are fighting in their minds for their own survival.
Yeah, I mean, you know, if you've read my writing, I don't just, give short shrift to the Holocaust and all of the suffering that has happened through Jewish history in Europe. I think for many of us, the problem is that those who have been abused have become abusers. And we know that happens generationally from place to place. So therefore, for the Palestinians, for the Arabs, they felt like they inherited a wounded people who had been scarred by European behavior. So therefore, they asked themselves, why is it we had to absorb this? Why is it that we have to then sort of bear the price for what happened in Russia or Germany? So as I'm sure you know, Arabs and Jews lived together peacefully in the Middle East for a very long time, for centuries, for millennia. They always have. This anti-Semitism is a very uniquely European issue. And sadly, Daryl, as we know, it actually has something to do with the church. But in Muslim contexts, not the same way. So from Baghdad to Cairo, there have been always large Jewish populations.
It's not particularly a European problem. It also extends into Asia. Russia is in Asia. It's not strictly European. And so it's a kind of global problem. But let me deal with something where I think we can agree about something, and that is the concerns for justice in the region are real. They belong in this conversation. Tim's question earlier: do I have to choose between justice and something else? It is on point here, and so. In my mind, it's actually wrestling with the dynamics that have created the cul-de-sac that the Middle East has become, because of a variety of features with contributions coming from all sides for the imbalances that we see. And if I can go back to something that Tim has alluded to from last week, what does this mean for me? What does it mean to the individual? It seems to me that what it means to the individual is, on the one hand, we need to recognize all the levels of the conversation, and I'll never concede that a theological discussion is a minuscule topic. But the second part of that is that it means that we have to be honest about injustice where it does appear, and wrestle with the causes of it at the same time. And that's an important consideration. And it drives my own theological expression that says, ultimately, I'm not thinking about a kind of nationalism. It drives my own consideration that says the consideration has to be given to the Palestinian and Arab issues that are raised in the Middle East. It raises the question of, equally coming back the other way, the way in which Israelis are sometimes handled by acts of what we might be regarded as terrorism and that kind of thing. This is a two-way street that we're dealing with that makes it such a difficult conversation.
Can I just jump in?
It's a two-way street, but whenever there has been a conflict, the number of deaths is always at best 14-1. So it isn't as if there's some violence from here, violence from there, so there's violence everywhere. No, it actually is just dramatically imbalanced. Anyway, but Daryl, the question that I always, just since we're talking about theology here, the question I guess that I sort of circle around is, and I really can't get my head around this, and you and I have talked about it before, and maybe we can make progress on this. I do not understand how we can say a secular Israeli Jew who is an atheist has access to the covenant promises of Abraham. I don't get that. Because then we have to say the branches broken off then still get to benefit from the tree, Romans 11.
Because the conversation is not strictly individual. Conversation is also corporate. The conversation isn't just that I've got, and the characterization of Israel as a secular state is in my mind a mischaracterization of the politics of the country. The politics of the country has intense religious elements built into it. You've got Orthodox Jews there. You've got other Jews, other sects of Judaism who are there. To characterize the state as strictly secular because you stay with an individual Israelite who happens to be an atheist, I just don't see how that follows.
Can I just interrupt the conversation very, if you don't mind? I must apologize, by the way. I lost my internet a while back, but and I just, if I may, can I just turn to Liam, and because this is a conversation about the Holy Land, and the Holy Land is not the same as Israel, as we know. So, and I just wondered if I could invite Liam just to reflect on that other part of this Holy Land, which is currently under occupation, which is peopled by, obviously there are Israelis who live in but generally speaking, it's regarded as illegal that they live there. The Palestinian people who are living in those occupied areas. I just wondered if we could branch out and bring the Palestinians into the conversation. I know they have featured, but maybe they could feature a little bit more, and I'm looking to Liam. And then after you've spoken, Liam, maybe we could take some of the questions in the time that we have left. Liam, please.
Yes, thanks, Tim. And I think this really touches on that point of marrying together the engagement with the theological debate along with the justice and peace debate. And I know it's a point that a lot of churches here, Catholic Church and others, have really emphasised, that in terms of our own engagement, in terms of pilgrimages, it's got to have both elements. It's got to be a personal journey. We've got to be engaging with the theology, the history, the holy sites, but also with the people and the fundamental issues of justice and peace. Because I think if you when, and I'm sure most people taking part here have been to the Holy Land, spent time in the Holy Land, and actually engaging with the Palestinian population and engaging with the majority of the Christian population in the Holy Land, these fundamental issues are shaping their everyday life. The issues of occupation, the issues of conflict, the deaths that take place in the regular fighting that was touched on there. And I'd really be interested to bring in the perspective from the local churches as well, because there's been quite a widespread rejection of Christian Zionism among Christian communities in the Holy Land, both at a sort of at a street level among a lot of the communities, but also there's been various declarations. So I think about 15, 16 years ago, there was the Jerusalem declarations from a number of the heads of churches engaging with the issue of Christian Zionism. And would just be really interested to hear Gary and Daryl's views on that, and whether the Christian communities, the Christian church leaders, Christians in the Holy Land, from the Palestinian communities and more broadly, have a particular role in engaging with this issue and with these theological questions, because it seems that often a lot of the time this theological debate is shaped by people outside the Holy Land looking in, and just be interested in your take on what particular role the local churches have in shaping our response to that.
Thank you, Liam. Let's take that question specifically, if we may, Gary and Daryl, and then we'll move to questions from the floor, so to speak. Thank you.
Yeah, Liam, it's a good question, and I'm glad you raised it. I think that I spend a great deal of time with the Palestinian community there. And I think they're in two minds. You can't generalize, really. They're, on the one hand, just as you see these arguments for blood and soil, and this sort of, even in the current election, sort of Israeli extreme right nationalism arising again and again in Israel, they see it in places like Syria and Egypt and other places. So they say to themselves, look, really, I would rather be in Israel than I'd rather be in one of these other countries. So they appreciate that Israel is striving to be a different kind of Middle Eastern nation. So they get that. On the other hand, they also see in the West Bank that their fate is combined with that of the Muslim Palestinian population. And so therefore, when Bethlehem is shot up or blockaded or whatever, they have the very same experience, and the Israeli army does not distinguish. So they find themselves suffering under occupation exactly like their Muslim neighbors. On the other hand, the Palestinian Christians who are living in places like Nazareth, for instance, or West Jerusalem, they will tend to say, we are second-class citizens, and they will list for you long lists of laws that are passed that actually discriminate against them, economically and socially and all that kind of thing. So, and they actually, the ones who have traveled well, they will say that their life in Israel is exactly like the life of a Black person under Jim Crow in the United States. So on the one hand, Palestinian Christians have a love-hate relationship with Israel. They see it as the safe haven, but then they see themselves discriminated against. And so it depends if it's Tuesday or Thursday when you're having those conversations with them.
I actually think that's a fair representation of what's going on, and addresses part of the challenge of the region. I'm also aware of conversations that are happening among some Messianic Christian groups and some Palestinian Christian groups that are trying to connect to one another at their Christian level in the midst of their ethnicity, and represent small pockets, because these aren't large populations, small pockets of people trying to sort through what's going on around them.
Liam, there's another very troubling development that I just came on just in the last year or two. And I actually, frankly, I'm not sure exactly where to go with it. And I'm not going to name names here. This wouldn't be right. But the Palestinians in the West Bank, the Christians, are impoverished, and the pastors are impoverished, and they don't have enough money even to a sustainable life for themselves as pastors. And so therefore, there have been Christian Zionists from the United States who have actually come to the West Bank and asked for, there's kind of a trade-off. If you will publicly bless the nation of Israel, then we will be able to give you funding for your ministry, funding for your church. There have been pastors in Bethlehem who have accepted this, and they actually are on YouTube and all of this, basically hugging and blessing Messianic Jews and Zionists at big conferences in Jerusalem. Well, once that happens, it fractures the Palestinian church, because then pastors are against pastors, congregations against congregations, and it's almost as if these Palestinian churches that take the money have been deeply compromised. I've tried to get to the bottom of it and actually learn more about it, but it's all hush hush. Nobody wants to talk about it. It's too shaming, too painful. Maybe you've heard about some of this, Liam, but it just breaks my heart. When someone is that impoverished, they will look for financial solutions wherever they can find them.
We have just 15 minutes left, and slightly less than that, really. And I want to just turn to some of the questions that have come through the chat, if I may. And because we don't have a lot of time, it would be great if the panel could answer these as succinctly as you possibly feel you can. And the first one actually is addressed to you, to Daryl. It's from Kathy Christensen, and she asks whether the Jewish history of anti-Semitism give Jews the right to commit a similar kind of anti-Palestinian demonstration and bigotry against the Arab native population of Palestine. That's perhaps putting it a bit boldly, but do you have any reflections, Daryl, or on whether or not the history of anti-Semitism, which, as Gary has pointed out, is something in which the Christian churches have had played a star role over the centuries? Does that bring with it a certain moral responsibility, or does it bring with it a certain moral exculpability? How do you see?
It doesn't bring moral exculpability. All it does is it helps to explain the mindset that leads to certain positions, but it doesn't take people off the hook. I mean, it's just so the short answer to the question is, to her question stated baldly, is no. That's not, that it doesn't allow an escape. It might allow for a bit of understanding as to why we are where we are, but it doesn't allow for escape. And this is why a push to try and be just is understood. But the only other caveat I would add is we've got to understand how we got here and what puts us in this position, or part of what puts us in this position, and address those concerns as well.
There's another question here. Thank you, Daryl. It's from Glenn, and I'm going to sort of shorten it, and I hope I do it justice. This is Glenn Benson. It's about it's about using the promise or abusing the promise, perhaps. Israelis who claim privilege based on the covenant promise on the one hand, and Christian Zionists who want to claim the privilege of God's gift for their appropriation of the promise. Now, this is something that, and this arises, says Glenn, from the human problem that we turn God's gift. It's part of our human nature to turn God's gift into a claim of our own privilege to possess, which seems to be uniquely powerful, if not toxic, in this particular context. And I just wondered if each of you would just like to maybe very, very succinctly comment on this. Indeed, is this uniquely problematic in this context, or is this something that we see everywhere?
Yeah, I think that you have a semantic confusion, which is in the center of this whole conversation. Because what happens is, in the church, people read Israel inside of the Old Testament, and then they see an Israeli flag and they say, oh, well, that's Israel. And people are not really thinking carefully about whether one is different than the other. Mm-hmm. It was quite intentional back at the very beginning with Ben Gurion, that they actually wanted to say, all of the Jews who are coming back to Israel from Europe, there is no cultural glue. progressive Jews from Berlin and those from Poland. How are we going to all be together? Ben-Gurion didn't really think that the Bible was historically valuable, but he said it's cultural glue for us. And therefore, what we want to do are a couple of things. We want to make sure that we say this country is called Israel. We're going to change the names of the towns that we have so they're all biblical names. He was interested in evoking biblical memory in Israel, not because it was something revealed from God, but because it was a cultural glue that would hold this society together. So, so it's almost as if there has been kind of a trick, a semantic trick that has been played. Ancient Israel, modern Israel, but one can barely compare them.
Liam, Daryl?
I think that's sorry, Darryl.
Go ahead, Liam.
I was just going to say, I think that's a really important point about the significance of semantics, and it really reminded me about the fact that, you know, when people are visiting the Holy Land, pilgrimages to the Holy Land, people can have completely different experiences of the reality there, and a lot of that is linked to the semantics, how we associate what we're seeing to specific parts of Scripture, and it really reinforces, I think, that discussion we were having earlier about the need for a thorough understanding of both the theology and the role that plays, but also the lived reality, the political situation, the justice and peace concerns as well.
Yeah, Liam, did you know that in 1948, they actually had a whole commission that was responsible for changing the vocabulary for the country? So, you know, all of the ancient names that have been used for 1,500 years, so as a tourist, you drive around the country and you see these names up on tourist signs and road signs, and you go, oh, I read that in the Old Testament someplace. And what that was is an intentional design going all the way back to the beginning.
Well, there is a history and a rootage, regardless of how you view that theologically, that is a part of what the people in the land have been. So it's like what you did with the term politics in separating it out from theology. Politics it comes from the word polis. It's about how people engage and relate to one another. And so theology, I don't know whether to say theology is a part of politics or politics is a part of theology.
That's
but
tricky.
Those, to separate those is very, very difficult to do, because as we also know, and this is part of this conversation, how one reads the theology relates to how you behave if you're theologically oriented at all. And even if you're atheological, if I can say it that way, it impacts how you interact and see things. So this the reason this space is contentious and has been is because it's been contentious and has been for millennia, not just centuries.
Yeah, see, I'm saying the changing of road signs is not theological at all. See, the motivation for changing the road signs is simply to create reminiscence,
But it's a reminiscence of a history of a people, whether
right.
the theological element is there or not. That's the point I'm making.
Yeah, I'm their motivation. There was no commitment to God. God assigned this name to this place, and therefore I think we want to go back to that. That's not what Ben-Gurion was up to.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I first of all want to apologize to the people who've asked questions and I haven't got around to them, although I'm going to rather sneakily get one in the final round. So apologies that we haven't been able to take all your questions. But we're going to finish off, and each of our speakers, I'm going to invite each of you, if you wouldn't mind, to speak for a couple of minutes, just with any last reflections that you would like to offer into the conversation. And this is the sneaky bit. If you could try and, in so doing, also just address a group who, as Lydia has pointed out, have not had much of a mention, namely the Muslim believers in the land. I'd invite you, if you could, just to say something about them too. But please, let's go around and we'll go in reverse order this time and begin with Liam, and then we'll go to Gary, and then we'll go to Daryl, and then we will close. Liam.
Thanks, Tim. And I think that point about making sure that we include all faiths, and including the Muslim community there, is a really critical one and can't be ignored from this discussion. When the Catholic Bishops' delegation, international delegation, visited Jerusalem in May, they issued a statement at the end around the status of Jerusalem and reaffirming the fact that it's a Jewish city, it's a Christian city, it's a Muslim city. And I think as a sort of final point, recognizing the importance of theology, of history, and as Daryl and Gary have talked about, that shaping the politics and lived reality today from all three of those faiths and traditions is critically important. And maybe coming back to that question right at the start about what's my role in all of this, probably recognizing the differing perspectives of others, including from different faiths, is something that we all need to be bringing into the conversation more.
Thank you, Liam. Gary.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And I think this has been a great conversation, and I hope all of us, everyone who's listening in, can see the contours clearly. That's really what you want in this, is so you can see clearly how positions are aligned. I think for me, I worry sometimes that these conversations about politics or theology are quite esoteric, and they're led by people who are living in the West. And I would hope that many of the people listening have an opportunity to visit this wonderful country. But when they do so, I hope they go beyond simply looking at biblical sites. I hope that they have an opportunity to meet the real people who live there. And that means meeting Jews, that means meeting Arabs, Muslims, because I think in these conversations, we easily stereotype every party here on the map in Israel. So I do a lot of these trips with students. In January, I'm going back again. And actually today, what I'm doing, it's November 1st. So in November, I always set up my appointments. And I make sure that my students have personal time, personal contact with every group that we've mentioned here: Palestinian Muslims, Palestinian Christians, and Jews, both secular and religious. That gives them the entire scope of what's in front of them. And I think I've noticed that when you put a human face on this issue, then the really hard edges of someone's arguments begin to fall away. And that's my hope for everybody who's listening in here, that yes, go to Israel, but remember that that it's a dangerous thing to go to Israel unaware of how these different points of view are playing out in front of you. Make sure that you meet people who are representing each of these positions.
Yeah, I actually have something very similar to what Gary said. I do think it's important to hear and engage at a personal level with all the voices of the people who are present. I think it's also important to understand the complexity of the history that has led into the moments that we find ourselves in. I think it's realistic to understand that if it took thousands of years to get here, this is going to be a very slow process in trying to make anything better. But the better way to do that is to have some awareness of the variety of positions that exist and what motivates them. And then I think for me as a Christian, my own faith is that Christ, as one who came to reconcile estranged groups. I mean, my goodness, you had Jews and Gentiles fighting in the Maccabean War. You had Jews and Gentiles in tension in the time of Christ. But he says, I want to form a people who all recognize they start from the same place with reference to God, and who are brought together on the basis of a pursuit of peace rather than conflict, and a recognition of their own sin and need as a result. That's part of what I would want to emphasize as a part of that conversation as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Daryl. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Liam. Thank you, everybody. It's bang on 1940, sorry, UK time, 7:45, time to close this seminar. But I really would like, if I may, on behalf of everybody, to thank our panelists, particularly for the clarity of your presentations, as well as their frankness. And Daryl, if I could just return to the title of your essay in this wonderful book, A Land Full of God. I mentioned it before. The title was Hope in the Midst of Mess. And I'd like us not to leave this conversation without a little bit of hope. And if I might just quote you, Gary, when you introduce the human face into the situation, which I think is what you've all just asked us to make sure that we do, the hard edges tend to fall away. So thank you for all three of you very, very much indeed. Thank you to all our listeners and our participants. And I hope you'll join us again next week for the third part in our series.